By the late summer of 1939, an intensive Nazi media campaign was stridently demanding that Germany be granted a land corridor through Poland that would link East Prussia to the rest of the country. Because the hated Treaty of Versailles had imposed this separation of German territory, there was widespread public support for what was seen as Germany's just territorial claim. The anti-Polish mood was further heightened by repeated accusations of Poland's severe mistreatment of its ethnic German population. On August 23, 1939, the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was signed in Moscow. While the bitter ideological hostility between the Nazi and communist regimes made the agreement paradoxical, this diplomatic move seemed to ensure peace with Russia if military hostilities broke out between Germany and Poland. Since Great Britain and France were not expected to go to war over Poland, a wider European conflict now appeared less likely. When I arrived back at the house in Hagen from a trip to Lüneburg on the morning of Sunday, August 27th, Aunt Dora handed me a special delivery telegram that had just arrived. It was an order from the Wehrmacht directing me to report the next day to the barracks in Lüneburg for a short period of military training. Until that moment, I still believed that I had another 4 months to complete my apprenticeship before I would be called to military service. Now it was clear that my plans might have to change. Despite this uncertainty, I was immediately swept up in a wave of eager anticipation that one feels at the start of an adventure. In my excitement, I did not know whether to call my parents or pack my belongings. When I reached my parents by phone, their reaction was more subdued. Naturally, my mother was particularly concerned. She made plans to come visit me that first week, though I saw little of her since boot camp was already underway. This unexpected induction into the army left me feeling something between a volunteer and a draftee. My earlier plans to enter a panzer unit in Berlin, where the army had assigned me, would not work out. Instead, the army had conscripted me into the newly established 58th Infantry Division. Pursuing a meticulously designed plan of expansion, the Wehrmacht created new divisions using a nucleus of troops from existing active duty divisions. The already existing 20th, 22nd and 30th Infantry Divisions based in northern Germany each provided a cadre of troops to train the freshly inducted recruits for the 58th Infantry Division's regiments. These divisions also provided the 58th Division with a veteran corps of personnel comprising about 20% of its final troop strength. In accordance with this plan, most of the Lüneburg-based 47th Infantry Regiment of the 22nd Infantry Division departed for the French border to deter any potential military action from the west. Only a cadre of experienced officers and sergeants from the regiment remained behind to instruct raw recruits who would bring the new 58th Infantry Division to full strength. For the duration of our basic training, the Army temporarily called up Great War veterans to fill out the ranks of the 58th Infantry Division in order to strengthen the German defences on the French border. Once our instruction was completed, we would replace these older reservists at the front. At this time, I still believed that my preliminary training period would only last a short time. When I arrived early that Monday morning at the former base of the 47th Infantry Regiment in the western part of Lüneburg, my initial excitement had somewhat cooled, though I did not share the sense of anxiety that most of the other conscripts seemed to feel. I thought to myself, this is it. I am going to be a soldier now and have to do my best. From the start, my competitive nature compelled me to prove myself and seek to become the top soldier in my unit. My aim was to obtain recognition in order to ultimately earn a leadership role. On reaching the barracks, all recruits were directed to the armory, where we were issued a uniform, helmet and boots. Because no one wore their hair long at that time, there was not a routine shaving of the recruits' heads. Following a lesson in how to salute properly, the drill instructors broke us into training companies. 8 conscripts shared a room sparsely furnished with 4 bunk beds and a table. Having worked inside similar buildings during my apprenticeship as an electrician, I was already intimately familiar with the solid 3-story brick and concrete structures typical of German barracks. Though they contained relative luxuries like indoor plumbing for community toilets and showers, recruits were in no way treated indulgently. Very strict maintenance regulations ensured that the buildings remained immaculate at all times. If the sergeant conducting an inspection spotted even some minor violation, it would mean extra duty for the guilty conscripts. At 7 o'clock the next morning, we headed out to an open area in the pinewoods behind the barracks, where the instructors placed our new company in line according to height. At this point, each recruit was officially inducted into the army and received the rank of private, Schütze. During the remainder of the week that followed, our drill instructors concentrated on teaching us how to march in close order and to goose-step as we began our transformation from civilians into soldiers. That Friday morning, September 1st, 1939, we woke to hear the radio solemnly announcing that Germany was at war with Poland. Among the conscripts around me, there was immediate recognition that we would not be released back into civilian life anytime soon. Though we would not be involved in the immediate campaign, my mother understood clearly what the news meant, telling my family, "Now Wilhelm must also go to war." Few Germans doubted the government's allegation that the Poles had started the war by staging a cross-border raid against a German radio station, and no one I knew questioned the basic justice of the war, even privately. Like most other citizens, I believed Germany had legitimate grievances and had launched the invasion of Poland following the exhaustion of diplomatic efforts. In retrospect, however, it is clear to me that Hitler sought war and simply exploited these issues to accomplish his aim. For him, the attack represented the next step in an aggressive plan of military conquest designed to impose Germany as the dominant power in Europe. The day after the start of the war, our induction ceremony was held in the drilling area behind the barracks. Standing at attention at the end of the event, we raised our right arms and swore the oath of loyalty for Wehrmacht soldiers. "I swear by God this sacred oath. I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath." In the days that followed, my fellow recruits and I generally tried to follow the progress of the war in Poland and regularly discussed the unfolding events among ourselves. While we had anticipated a short conflict, most of us nonetheless felt disappointed to have missed out on it when the war ended a few weeks later. Perhaps naively, we did not expect to have another chance to engage in combat, even though Britain and France had unexpectedly declared war on Germany in early September. None of our officers led us to believe differently. Training in Lüneburg, September 4th, 1939. January 9th, 1940. Once we had learned how to march that first week, our company commenced its field training, which took place every day, regardless of rain or snow. It was about evenly divided between physical exercise to build our stamina and instruction in the use of weapons and other equipment. More basically, it was about learning unquestioning obedience to orders. On most mornings, we would wake before dawn for a shower and breakfast. After strapping on our 25-pound backpacks, we formed up for the 3 or 4 mile hike out to the firing range in Wendisch Even. At the start of the march, the second lieutenant, lieutenant or sergeant in charge, would shout, "Ein Lied," a song, and then call out a title. Singing these marching tunes with enthusiasm, we set out down the road. Reaching the site that first day, we immediately commenced drilling in an area of sandy terrain of low hills and pines. After an introduction to the bolt-action Karabiner 98K Mauser rifle that would serve as our primary weapon, our first days were spent at target practice. Both in daylight and darkness, we practiced how to disassemble and properly clean the rifle, a task that was essential to perform a couple of times a week in order to prevent jamming. In addition to working with the Mauser, our instructors soon taught us to handle and maintain a variety of other weapons as well. All members of our training company received a cursory introduction to larger weapons like the 75mm howitzer. This allowed us to have a basic level of familiarity with such weapons if we needed to operate them in an emergency. Our brief instruction in how to calculate the coordinates of an enemy target and direct the fire of the heavy guns was especially interesting to me and would prove invaluable later. Even more elemental to soldiering, our veteran drill instructors passed along essential combat survival skills, In particular, the lesson that a good infantryman should dig a foxhole and get below ground whenever possible would save my life many times. Though usually returning from the firing range before dark, we occasionally engaged in training at night. The return march back to the barracks was sometimes converted into a race among the 100 or so men of my training company. Jogging most of the way, I regularly completed the 3 or 4 miles before the others. Perhaps because I usually led the way in these races, the lieutenant in charge of our drilling assigned me the job of leading his horse to the stable, whereas the other soldiers had to clean the barracks or perform a similar, less desirable task. While a portion of the troops in the company acquired more extensive instruction with mortars and the 75mm short-barreled howitzer, I was assigned early on to our company's communications platoon. With my civilian background as an electrician, it was natural for me to join this unit. It also made sense to have the fastest members of our company in the communications platoon, since they might be called on to serve as runners to deliver messages on foot, if communication links had not yet been established or had been destroyed. After the first couple of weeks, I spent the majority of time drilling with this communications unit. Our instructors gave us specialized training in the operation and repair of radios, field telephones, telegraphs, and other equipment. Most of our time, however, was spent practicing the stringing and maintaining of communication lines. On the battlefield, these lines would be used to deliver targeting information from the forward observer's position back to gun batteries and company headquarters, as well as from the company headquarters back to the regimental command. On many mornings that fall, the platoon practiced running a line the entire distance from the barracks to the firing range. Each of us carried a large reel on our backs with a portion of line that would be linked to the end of the preceding length of wire and then spooled out. As the line was released, those following would use long poles to hook it over limbs up in the trees, where it would be less vulnerable to shell fire in a combat situation. Since my grandparents' villa was located near our training area in Vendish Evan, I chanced stopping off there a couple of times on the way back to our barracks in Lüneburg. Despite the risk of punishment if I was caught, a cup of coffee with my grandmother provided a great momentary escape from our routine. About once or twice a week after our return from the firing range, the lieutenant overseeing our drilling would announce, "It's 5 o'clock now. In 15 minutes you will be outside in formation in a clean uniform." After changing into a fresh uniform, we would wearily head out to the drilling area in the pine woods behind the barracks. In general, my efforts to prove myself and gain top marks proved successful, but I struggled with one particular facet of training: tree climbing. Even with a sergeant loudly badgering us, "Get up in the tree, you monkeys!" I usually only succeeded in ascending about 10 feet. If I avoided sliding backward from that point, I would just hang there like an old sack. Fortunately, I performed better when the drill instructors required us to build entrenchments or to crawl on our hands and knees under barbed wire without becoming entangled, as a sergeant yelled at us to keep our butts down. A short time after the commencement of our training, I befriended a couple of other conscripts, Willi Schutter and Willi Sork, who would remain my closest comrades in the coming years. In particular, I came to know Willi Schutter, with whom I frequently played cards. He was a nice guy who came from the small town of Bleckede. Standing only about 5 feet 8 inches, he was squarely built and strong. Schutter was generally quiet, but also, like me, a bit of a prankster. He was eventually assigned to serve with one of our gun crews. Our meals from the mess were decent and filling, but we never knew for sure what we were eating or drinking. Every morning, someone in each platoon in the barracks had to go pick up a big pot of coffee from the mess hall. If a conscript committed some violation of the regulations, his platoon leader would delegate him to deliver the coffee for the week. After fulfilling this duty for a couple of weeks, one of the men in our platoon was finally informed that his punishment was complete and he would no longer have to retrieve the coffee pot. He replied with satisfaction, "Good, then I do not have to piss in the coffee anymore." While the other troops found this prank amusing, our platoon wondered what we had been drinking. In another instance, one first lieutenant in our regiment brought his horse up the stairs into the barracks. Though he may have been half drunk at the time, I have no doubt that this officer was demonstrating to us that his aristocratic Prussian background entitled him to flaunt the regulations with impunity. Later, we would encounter a far different type of Prussian officer in our first company commander. As recruits, we were only permitted a couple of hours out of the barracks on Sunday evenings. Occasionally, I visited Aunt and Uncle Stork to see my brother Herman and have supper, but most of my free time was spent with Anneliese. Just as before the war, we would sometimes go dancing or see a movie. More often, we would go for a walk or just sit on a bench and talk. Of course, kissing was not unknown in these few moments together, but she was always much more concerned than me that we might be seen. Taking Anneliese back to her residence at the florist shop one Sunday night after a stroll, I became so engrossed in our conversation that I lost track of the time. The distant blaring of a bugle from across town alerted me that only minutes remained before our 10 o'clock deadline to report to the barracks. With a quick kiss goodnight, I took off in a mad dash. Covering the mile as fast as my legs could move, I passed the sentry post minutes later, completely exhausted, but just on time. On another occasion, following a leave from duty spent with my family in Puggen, I missed the train on which I had planned to return from Salzwedel to Lüneburg. Not seeing any alternative, I caught a taxi all the way back in order to reach our barracks before 10. The hour-long trip cost me a small fortune, but I knew that my failure to return on time would have resulted in stern disciplinary measures. Our training staff would tolerate a late arrival due to a missed train no sooner than they would excuse any other infraction. The officers and sergeants imposed a rigorous regimen during our basic training, but I found deep satisfaction in the discipline, camaraderie, adventure and ascetic routine of soldiering. At the end of boot camp on January 9th, 1940, my sense of accomplishment and pride was great, especially given the recognition I received as one of the top cadets. January 9th, 1940 to May 9th, 1940. Immediately after our initial training concluded, the Army shipped us 90 miles west by train to Delmenhorst, home base of the 58th Infantry Division's 154th Regiment. On our arrival, we joined additional troops of the 154th Infantry Regiment, who had also just completed their training under the guidance of other cadres drawn from the 22nd Infantry Division. Since the size of different military subunits varies among armies, it is perhaps worthwhile to outline briefly the composition and relative strengths of the infantry components in the German Army in 1940. A squad consisting of 10 soldiers was the smallest operational unit, and a platoon of 4 squads was the primary sub-unit of a company. A regular infantry company contained about 180 men, though specialized companies could be significantly larger. Each battalion contained 4 companies, while each regiment included 3 battalions and 2 specialized companies. An infantry division was made up of roughly 3 infantry regiments, an artillery regiment, a battalion with anti-tank weapons, a reconnaissance battalion, a headquarters unit and support troops, possessing a total strength of approximately 17,000 men. Above the divisional level, the corps, army and army groups varied greatly in size and composition. Once the regimental organization in Delmenhorst was completed on February 5th, the new 154th Infantry Regiment made the roughly 250-mile journey south to the large training area at Ohrdruf in the hilly wooded region of Thüringen. On our arrival, our regiment united with the newly trained soldiers of the 209th and 220th Infantry Regiments and the Artillery Regiment, bringing together for the first time all the elements of the 58th Infantry Division. Over the next 2 weeks, our regiments were organized into companies. Assigned to the communications platoon of the 13th Infantry Company of the 154th Infantry Regiment, I would be part of the largest of the regiment's 14 companies, which had a full strength of about 300 troops. In our communications platoon, there were about 25 men, all of whom had trained together in Lüneburg. Subtracting the soldiers in our platoon who drove the wagons carrying our communications gear and took care of the horses, there were about 15 of us whose primary assignment was to set up communications links and, if necessary, to serve as runners. The 13th Company's 2 short-barreled 150mm howitzers and 6 short-barreled 75mm howitzers would be positioned half a mile to a mile behind the front and provide the regiment with an independent light artillery capability in support of the regimental infantry in its frontline actions. In contrast, the division's artillery regiment had long-range guns that would be deployed a number of miles back behind the front lines and generally conduct fire missions against the enemy's more distant rear areas. While the regiment's 13th Company deployed howitzers and its 14th Company operated anti-tank weapons, the other 12 companies making up the 3 battalions in our regiment were regular infantry troops, possessing only small arms, machine guns, and small-caliber mortars. While these 12 regular infantry companies primarily reported to their respective battalion-level commanders, the 13th and 14th Companies operated independently and reported directly to the regimental commander because of their unique missions. As our new regiments organized, the Wehrmacht demobilized the Great War veterans who had been temporarily called up to fill out the ranks of the 58th Infantry Division on the French border during our training period. The demobilization of veterans also released the leadership cadre from the old active duty army to join our company, though these members of the regular army only comprised perhaps 20% of our total strength. Soon after our company had taken shape in Ohrdruf, an officer named Robert Miles Reinke introduced himself and the other new senior platoon leaders to us. A veteran of the Great War in his 50s, he was referred to as Rittmeister, cavalry captain, for his earlier service in the army's equestrian arm. In fact, Reinke's horsemanship was so exceptional that he had served as the Capitan of Germany's polo team in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Though a highly experienced officer, he had been working as a businessman in Hamburg when he was called back to duty. As was customary for those in the Prussian officer class, he maintained an aloof distance and businesslike attitude towards subordinates, but his commanding presence only magnified our respect. Our confidence in his ability to lead our company would prove fully justified. Under Reinke, there were 2 first lieutenants, but the non-commissioned officers, NCOs, played an equally essential role in running the company. As the highest-ranking NCO, Senior Sergeant Juchter was the most important because he served as quartermaster, overseeing the distribution of food and ammunition supplies from the Tross, rear area. Highly proficient in his work, he was referred to as the mother of the company. In Ohrdruf, our communications platoon was placed under the command of Staff Sergeant Oberfeldwebel Ehlert, who had come over with the cadre of career officers and NCOs who had been serving on the French border. An easygoing, well-educated man in his mid-20s, he would remain my immediate superior throughout the next 3.5 years. Ehlert always maintained a certain distance from us and was reserved by nature, but was a good soldier and a highly competent NCO who served as our primary role model. Following our arrival in Ohrdruf, the army forbade us to reveal our location in letters to our families and girlfriends back home. Since such restrictions appeared to be unnecessarily secretive to me, I would sometimes enclose a photograph that would, incidentally, include a public sign identifying the name of the village or city near which we were stationed in order to get around the censors. In addition to exchanging letters with my family, I also corresponded with Anneliese back in Lüneburg, though our relationship still remained less than serious. She never expressed any particular fear about my fate as we prepared for war, though at that time I myself was not really concerned about what might happen in combat. In the vigour of youth, you naturally feel indestructible and tend to view war as a chance for adventure. If we had been older and wiser, our fears about the future would have been far greater. During our training in Lüneburg, we had developed our basic soldiering skills and received specific instruction in some type of specialized function, such as communications. At Ohrdruf, we now engaged in advanced military exercises, designed to teach us how to fight and defeat the enemy in battle. Repeatedly, the officers drilled us in basic offensive and defensive infantry tactics. Starting with our heavy weapons company, we gradually learned to operate in larger and larger formations. Eventually, the entire division joined together in field maneuvers. Despite the cold and snow in Thüringen, we trained continuously and soon began engaging in simulated full-scale battles. Our officers made an effort to approximate actual combat conditions as closely as possible. In addition to maneuvers, the division also continued with the other aspects of our training and worked on improving our marksmanship. Knowing that we were preparing for combat, there was no lack of motivation on our part as we drilled intensively from early in the morning until dark. There was little time for anything other than military exercises and sleeping in the homes or tents where we had been billeted. Occasionally, we also trained at night. In the winter cold, none of us looked forward to our turn on regular sentry duty. However, it was a privilege to be assigned as an honor guard for Heldengedenktag, Heroes' Memorial Day, commemorating the millions of German soldiers lost during the Great War. It fell on March 10, 1940, which turned out to be an icy Sunday. During my 45-minute shift posted in front of the war monument in Ohrdruf, local kids approached and tried to make me laugh. It was easy to ignore them, but almost impossible to keep my body from freezing while remaining rigidly at attention. Only later would I learn what it meant to be truly cold. 4 days afterward, the division boarded trains for a roughly 275-mile trip through the night to an area south of the city of Trier, in the bend of the Saar River near the town of Oorscholz. Moving into positions just opposite the northern corner of France's Maginot Line defences along the Franco-German border, we were deployed as part of the 23rd Corps of the 16th Army in Army Group A, while our infantry company obtained living space in the elaborate frontline bunkers of Germany's West Wall defences. Other troops were housed in local villages or in tents. Soon afterward, a number of promotions were issued, following the observation of our performance at Lüneburg and Ohrdruf. Receiving the rank of Private First Class, Gefreiter, I felt like my efforts to prove myself in our training had been rewarded, even if the greater test of combat had not yet arrived. The politics of war were rarely discussed at the front, but most Germans I knew accepted the necessity and justice of our struggle against France and Great Britain. They had declared war on Germany in reaction to the invasion of Poland. As we saw it, they were attempting to defend the unjust settlement of the Treaty of Versailles. They would not accept a new political settlement unless Germany imposed it on them with military force. Already there were sporadic border skirmishes with French troops in our sector of the front, as well as occasional clashes between the Luftwaffe and enemy aircraft. If ordered to fight a full-scale war, we were confident in our ability to conduct operations rapidly and efficiently. Rather than another long stalemate in the trenches like Germany had endured in France during the Great War, everyone expected that a new campaign in the West would be rapid, following the model of the recently conducted war against Poland. As the weather grew warmer that spring, the mood among the troops around me was one of anxious anticipation. Though motivated by love of country and possessing a sense of pride in our company, regiment and division, we would quickly learn that the most basic priorities in combat were simply to obey orders and look out for ourselves and our comrades. Early on a bright May 10th morning, in the sky high above our bunkers, German pilots engaged their French and British opponents, putting on an aerial display that we observed with fascination. The chatter of their machine guns resonated to us on the ground, as the planes chased and dodged each other in a relentless duel for position. When an aircraft spun down from the sky in flames, there was applause for the victor of the dogfight, as if we were at a sporting event, despite our inability to discern whether the loser had been the enemy. Within a short time, 5 or 6 planes came down, some as close as 3 or 4 miles from us. Only then did word reach us that some of the burning wrecks were German, quickly sobering our mood. After moving up to the frontier with France, the 58th Division directed a small force to cross the Moselle River just south of Luxembourg. The detachment's subsequent frontal assault against a short sector of France's heavily fortified Maginot Line may have accomplished some larger strategic purpose, but it did so only at the cost of heavy casualties among the attackers. On May 18th, our division was relieved by other German forces and moved back to the rear. This operation reflects the contrast between our approach to military objectives in France and the conduct of our future operations. In France, we simply followed orders as we had been trained. If commanded to seize a position by a certain time, we typically would attack the objective in a head-on manner, suffering heavy casualties in the process. Later in the war, our officers generally would not carry out operations until first determining the most efficient tactical approach and the type of support necessary to minimize infantry casualties. These types of deliberations occurred to some extent in France, but the old Prussian attitude of "do it" prevailed more often. 2 days after pulling back towards Orscholz, our division crossed into Luxembourg, strung out in a long procession of men, horses and vehicles. The most common type of vehicle in our company was a squad supply wagon, pulled by 2 horses. Hauling our personal belongings such as clothes and food, these wagons allowed us to march with only our rifles and ammunition. Despite being freed of the backpacks, water can, gas mask and other gear that we would have carried in the field, long treks on foot were still exhausting. To get off our feet, most of us managed to grab a temporary seat on a supply wagon or somewhere on a protze. This was a combination of 2 separate 2-wheeled carriages, one which carried ammunition and one on which the gun crew rode, with the howitzer towed behind. While a protze with the 75mm howitzer required 4 horses, a protze with the far heavier 150mm howitzer needed a complement of 6 horses. As was the privilege of every company commander, Rittmeister Reinke rode a horse that had its own designated handler, but most handlers were responsible for the care of 4 or 5 horses. This added up to a substantial amount of manpower given the number of horses involved. In order to obtain an adequate number of horses in the period leading up to the war, the Wehrmacht requisitioned them from farms all over Germany, with some farms having to surrender up to half their stock. Because the requisition was supposedly a temporary measure that would only last for the duration of what was expected to be a short conflict, farmers received no compensation. Not surprisingly, the Wehrmacht ceased such unpopular measures as soon as it could obtain horses from conquered territories. Our rapid march through Luxembourg's immaculate towns and villages soon took us into southern Belgium, allowing us to pass well north of the Maginot Line. Despite signs of much prior activity on the roads, we were unaware that only a few days earlier, German panzer divisions had broken through the French defences in this same area. These armoured formations were now approaching the English Channel far to the west, completely undermining the French and British position. The French campaign had already been won in a strategic sense, but there was still another month of fighting ahead. At the end of an 80-mile march over 5 days, the 209th and 220th Regiments of our division entered France on May 23rd, taking up a position on the front line about 10 miles southeast of the city of Sedan. Replacing other German units, these regiments spread out in the 4-mile-wide area between the French towns of Carignan and Mouzon. Meanwhile, the 154th Regiment was temporarily held behind as a reserve force on the north side of the Meuse River at Arlon in Belgium, until we could be relieved by other German forces. Once our regiment reached the front, I learned how bitter the initial fighting had been. Advancing into action, our division had confronted ferocious resistance from a French-Algerian division from North Africa. In what proved the 58th's toughest combat of the campaign, these Algerian troops were firing down at our infantry from concealed positions up in the trees. To make progress, our infantry had to deploy snipers and spray machine gun fire into the trees. In some cases, they even used flamethrowers to burn the Algerians out. During these types of battles, the front often became fluid, intermingling our troops with the enemy's forces. In such circumstances, a regiment's heavy gun company could not safely employ the fire support of its howitzers. Instead, the infantry would have to rely on the division's long-range artillery to hammer the French rear areas in order to prevent enemy reinforcements from reaching the front. By May 25th, our regiment had marched the 45 miles from Arlon, reaching the division's new front line in the French town of Beaumonton-Argonne. That afternoon, I received orders from Staff Sergeant Ehlert to carry a message on foot to one of our units posted on the front. My objective was the small village of Pouilly-sur-Meuse, situated in a valley on the banks of the Meuse River, about 3 miles to the west of Beaumont-en-Argonne. There was no hesitation or deliberation on my part. An order was simply obeyed without question. Generally more gung-ho than most of the other members of my platoon, I was anxious to prove myself in combat, though my enthusiasm was tempered by a certain apprehension, since I did not know what to expect. The road to the village ran down a hill bereft of any tree cover, leaving me fully exposed to enemy observation and artillery fire. As I proceeded forward down the slope, there was no one else in sight. Spotting my movement, French artillery almost immediately opened up. Hearing the first round streaking toward the hill, I lunged into a drainage ditch beside the road just before the shell exploded about 100 yards ahead of me. Later, I would learn how to interpret the sound of a shell's whistle through the air to determine its proximity and actual threat. In Russia, I would have said, 100 yards away, let them shoot. In my first encounter with enemy shellfire, however, everything sounded dangerously close. Shells continued to impact to the right and left of me, with the closest landing perhaps 50 yards away. Each time I heard the whistle of another incoming round, I would jump back down into the drainage ditch that ran beside the road. If all remained quiet for a minute, I would leap to my feet and make a crouched run until I heard the sound of the next shell. Repeating this process more than a dozen times, it took me about an hour and a half to advance perhaps a mile. At dusk, I finally arrived at our forward position in Pouilly-sur-Meuse and delivered my message to the officer in charge. While no longer out in the open, the village afforded little protection from the French artillery, which was slamming in a merciless barrage of 5 or 6 heavy shells a minute. That night, I took shelter in the large wine cellar of a fieldstone house, huddled with 20 or 30 soldiers from another unit. The violent shaking of the earth was almost constant, as round after round crashed into Pouilly. With a steady rain of dust from the ceiling in the pitch-black darkness, it was hard not to ponder the consequences if the house received a direct hit. When the artillery fire ceased toward daybreak, I departed the ruined village by the previous day's route before it became fully light. With no one targeting me on my climb back up the hill toward my unit in Beaumont-en-Argonne, the return trip was far more relaxed. Happening across a fully intact 75mm French artillery round that had failed to detonate because it lacked its explosive charge, I decided to retain it as a souvenir of my baptism of fire and lugged the heavy shell back under my arm. For my performance in this mission and a series of other assignments, I would subsequently receive the Iron Cross Second Class for bravery on December 10, 1941. Yet, I already felt that I had achieved something greater. If combat can make a man out of a boy in a day, my experience on the hill and in the cellar had made me grow up fast, even if it was only a prelude to what I would endure in the coming years. The next day, on May 27th, the 209th and 220th Regiments made an assault through a wooded area in an attempt to seize the village of Hainaut, located another mile or so beyond Pouilly-sur-Meuse. With Hainaut still in French hands at the end of 3 days of bitter fighting, the 71st Infantry Division relieved our exhausted troops in the eastern portion of the 58th Division's sector. Meanwhile, following the evacuation of British and French forces in the north from Dunkirk to England in late May and early June, the entire German army was reorienting itself toward the south to attack the remaining French forces. On June 5th, Germany began the Battle of France with a massive offensive. 4 days later, our 154th Regiment staged an attack to seize control of the forest at Bois de la Vache, Wood of the Cow, which bounded the main road to the southeast about a mile from Beaumont-en-Argonne. As we began our advance south, the French artillery again began to fire on us, but this time they were using gas shells. Having trained for just such an eventuality, we hurriedly yanked on our gas masks. Much to our amazement, the shells turned out to be duds. A subsequent examination of these rounds revealed that they had been manufactured by the German company Krupp in 1918 and delivered to the French as war reparations. Our assault on the Bois de la Vache met further fierce resistance from the North African Division and quickly broke down, forcing us to pull back with heavy losses. However, larger developments in the Battle of France soon forced the enemy troops to our front to join in the general French retreat to the south. By June 11th, the way was open for the renewal of our advance. June 11th to June 25th, 1940. Now the campaign in France progressed more and more rapidly. Our troops and horse-drawn vehicles were constantly on the move, as the French steadily retreated before us. During the advance southward, it only proved necessary for our infantry and howitzers to deploy into combat formation about 3 or 4 times. Most of these actions turned out to be brief skirmishes lasting less than an hour. They typically began with a sudden barrage from French artillery that forced our infantry to spread out and seek cover. If our infantry encountered significant defensive positions, such as entrenched enemy infantry or a French bunker, the regiment would request supporting fire from our heavy weapons company. The 13th Company would then station our howitzers and ammunition as far forward as possible without coming under fire, generally within a half-mile of the first line. In most cases, our 75mm howitzers were capable of dealing with any problems that arose, and the 150mm guns would not be brought into action. Unless the resistance from the enemy appeared to require sustained support from the heavy guns, the ammunition would not even be unloaded from its carriage. Meanwhile, the horses and the Protzen would retreat to the Tross some miles further back, but remain ready to retrieve the howitzer and ammunition on short notice. Except when this deployment was very brief, my communications platoon would string the telephone lines between the forward observer at the front and the company's gun positions, company headquarters, and regimental headquarters in the rear. We also had to maintain the integrity of these lines, which were highly vulnerable to enemy artillery fire. Due to reports of poisoned wells, we were informed that we could not drink the local water. To quench our thirst, we began hunting for wine in the cellars of homes. At the end of a short search, several soldiers in my communications platoon liberated a wooden cask of wine and hauled it outside. Once the heavy barrel had been hoisted up on the rear of a still-moving Protze, someone asked aloud, "Now how are we going to get the damned thing open?" "I have an answer," a soldier replied, and pulling out his Luger pistol, he fired a round into the cask. With red wine now spurting out through the bullet hole onto the road, dozens of us immediately began taking turns walking behind the barrel to catch the dark stream in our mouths as we continued to march. Upon my arrival at a church in a small town a little farther south, I heard that 2 French snipers perched high in the steeple had picked off a number of our troops a few hours earlier. Following the capture of the 2 French soldiers, many of our troops wanted retribution for the deaths they had caused among our men. As punishment, an officer in our regiment ordered that the snipers be forced to spend a couple of hours kneeling on the concrete steps in front of the church's altar before being led back to one of our prisoner-of-war camps. On June 16th, we entered Dun-sur-Meuse, about 15 miles south of Beaumont-en-Argonne. The following day, my 20th birthday, the 58th Infantry Division reached Verdun, a full 20 miles farther south. Up on a hill, a large cemetery from the largest and bloodiest Franco-German battlefield reminded us of the catastrophic cost our fathers had paid in the First World War. Whatever the historical parallels, there could not have been a more stark contrast with the relative ease of our advance after only a month of combat. The next day we accomplished another 20-mile march and entered Saint-Mihiel, where there were more small skirmishes. This progress was achieved despite the increasing numbers of French civilians who jammed the roads to the south as they attempted to flee ahead of our advance. Forced to the side of the road to permit our passage, the mostly women and children refugees lingered among their horse-driven wagons and cars, crammed with their household possessions. From their despondent faces and blank stares, it was clear that their spirit was crushed. It was impossible to regard such a heart-rending scene and not feel pity. After Saint-Mihiel, we made our fastest advance to date, covering the 30 miles to Toul in a single day. Finding a position on a ridge overlooking the city, I looked down on Fort Saint-Michel, where a number of French troops were making a stand. Our 150mm and 75mm howitzers soon arrived, and went into action with the division's heavy artillery to pound these fortifications. In these circumstances, the fire support mission for our heavy guns and the artillery was to prevent the enemy from offering effective resistance or to force them to retreat. If our infantry could move forward under our suppressing fire, it was not necessary to obliterate the target. At the end of a 20-minute barrage, our troops were able to take control of the fort as the French inside either pulled back or surrendered. Once Toul was occupied, we halted our march. On June 22nd, word began to filter among us that the French government, realizing that further resistance was futile, had agreed to sign a Waffenstillstand, armistice, to come into effect on June 25th. Despite accomplishing in 6 weeks what our fathers had failed to achieve in 4 years of fighting, there was momentary jubilation, but no real celebration. If this was war, it was a lot easier than we had imagined. After a brief stay on the outskirts of Toul, we travelled a short distance to the neighbouring Champagne region, where we gladly seized the opportunity to relax in relative luxury for a few days. Since the owners of the abandoned home in which several of us were quartered had obligingly stocked their cellar with a couple of 100 bottles of the region's dry, sparkling wine, we naturally swigged down all we could handle. Indeed, there was so much of the stuff that my comrades and I even used it to brush our teeth and spray clean the floors of the rooms. Back in Germany, the victory made Hitler and the Nazis more popular than they would ever be again. While most citizens at home probably attributed the rapid defeat of the French army to the superior quality of German officers and troops, I believed that our success resulted at least as much from the failings of the French military leadership and the lack of will to fight on the part of the French soldiers. The national stereotyping that portrays the French as more focused on enjoying life and the Germans as more task-oriented seemed to have been borne out on the battlefield. The French troops appeared to have low morale and a higher concern for saving their own skins than for winning the war. In contrast, the German soldiers around me were highly motivated and determined to complete the designated mission. In a tough fight, a French soldier's mentality was, "Things look bad, let's get the hell out of here." In the same situation, the German soldier would say, "Let's fight that son of a bitch and win this thing." Still, the 58th Infantry Division had not escaped losses. The fighting had killed 23 officers, 120 NCOs, and 533 other enlisted personnel, most of whom had served in the infantry companies that always bore the brunt of the combat. Finishing the mission that the army had assigned us, our main wish now was to return home. Following our victory over France, most Germans believed that Great Britain would soon be forced to accede to a negotiated peace settlement. At the same time, we soldiers knew that as long as the British still confronted us, the war was not yet over. Some of us expected that an invasion of England might be necessary, but no one imagined that a year later we would be fighting in Russia. July 4th, 1940. April 24th, 1941. In early July, we departed the Champagne region, heading north to occupation duty in Belgium. At one point, our route of march took us behind part of the Maginot Line, which now seemed a symbol of all that had gone wrong for France. Covering roughly 200 miles in 10 days, the 58th Division finally arrived in the town of Tongeren, located in the Flemish region of Belgium, about 15 miles north of Liège. Our posting to Tongeren proved to be very brief. At the end of July, we made a 25-mile march to the town of Verviers in the French-speaking region of Belgium. In Verviers, our regiment was billeted in rooms and entire homes requisitioned by the army in a little village on the southern outskirts of the town. Sleeping 3 or 4 to a room, we bunked down on makeshift beds on the floor. Because I spoke a little French, I was assigned to serve as our company's translator to deal with various problems that arose with the local civilians, though fortunately there were no major difficulties. With light responsibilities in Belgium, our company commander soon began issuing leaves from duty. His selections were based on the recommendations of Senior Sergeant Juchter, who kept track of which soldiers were due a furlough based on the length of time since their last leave. On average, a furlough lasting 3 weeks would be granted about once a year. Obtaining my first leave since Lüneburg on August 10th, I caught the train from Verviers, not forgetting to stow the souvenir shell from my baptism of fire in my luggage. Upon my arrival in Puggen, I received a warm welcome from my family, who treated me like I was a military hero. Feeling more like I was on vacation than on a furlough, it was easy for me to re-enter the routines of life on the farm. My brief experience in combat during the French campaign left me feeling like a man, but had changed me relatively little. In the middle of my leave, I made the 100-mile train journey to Hamburg to visit Anneliese for a few days. After over half a year apart, we decided to wait to meet her family and instead spend our short time together seeing the city. Following my return to Verviers from Puggen on August 30th, I settled into the relaxed routine of occupation duty. On a typical day, we spent about 4 hours drilling in order to maintain and sharpen our combat skills. The earlier training had prepared us well for the rigours of combat, and we did not want to lose our edge. Our regiment also organised a couple of large-scale sporting competitions for the troops. Running in a tight 400-metre race, I hurled my body across the finish line at the last second, just barely pulling out a win over my opponents. On weekends, there were frequent opportunities for us to take the 15 or 20-minute tram ride into the downtown area from the village where we were based. Normally, the regiment allowed us to leave about noon and required us to return to our assigned quarters by 9 o'clock. While encountering occasional hostility from the Belgian population, most civilians behaved in a correct manner, or at least treated us with indifference. We felt at ease as we shopped and roamed around the city. Perhaps surprisingly, some of the local girls were very receptive to a German soldier in uniform and would flirt with us shamelessly. They were often willing to join us for coffee or a drink at one of Vervier's sidewalk cafes or restaurants. While German troops ordinarily would enjoy the pleasure of female company for an afternoon or evening of innocent relaxation, a few of our soldiers developed more intimate relationships with Belgian women. About this time, we received a small black, white and red cord to wear over our left shoulder, indicating that we were members of the 58th Infantry Division. Like other German divisions, the 58th's conscripts and future replacements were drawn from a specific region, in our case almost exclusively from northern Germany and the region of Niedersachsen. Reflecting the importance of horse farms in the traditions and economy of the region, the 58th Division introduced 2 horse heads facing in opposite directions as our divisional insignia, which we sewed on the left shoulder of our uniforms. This common regional background enhanced our sense of unit pride and camaraderie. A couple of months after our arrival in Belgium, we received a lecture from our company commander, Rittmeister Reinke. Since he had English relatives, he may somehow have learned that the British were anticipating a cross-channel invasion and wanted to prepare us psychologically. As we stood at attention, he warned us, "Boys, what you have seen in France is nothing. In the coming fight, you will be happy to dig yourself into a foxhole as fast as you can. It will be a lot tougher than what you experienced so far." As a combat veteran of the First World War, Reinke knew from first-hand experience how much worse war could be. We were sorry to lose this respected officer soon afterward when he was promoted to take over the 2nd Battalion of the 154th Regiment. He was replaced by First Lieutenant von Kempsky, who had previously commanded one of our company's platoons. During our time in Verviers, we tried to keep up with the news, but found it difficult to closely follow the course of the Battle of Britain that was then being fought by the Luftwaffe against the Royal Air Force. Though we knew nothing about it at the time, our divisional staff scouted out training areas in Holland, preparing for a possible move to the area for an invasion of Britain. Selected elements of our division actually conducted specialised training on boats in Antwerp and Rotterdam, but our heavy weapons company did nothing in particular to prepare for an amphibious operation. There was broad recognition that any such assault from the sea would be costly, yet most of the men around me favoured making the invasion, believing that it was the only way to bring a true end to the war. We were unaware that plans for Operation Sea Lion called for the German 9th and 16th Armies to seize a stretch of coast in southeast England. As part of the 16th Army, the 58th Division was slated to arrive in the third echelon of forces, landing in the area between Folkestone and New Romney, about 70 miles southeast of the centre of London. When we finally realised in April of 1941 that an invasion would not occur, some of us felt a sense of disappointment, wondering how Germany could ever achieve a final peace if Britain remained undefeated. That fall, I met 2 sisters who were relatives of the Belgian family with whom I was billeted. They would try to speak German with me, and I would practice my French with them. On perhaps 10 occasions, they invited me to visit their family's home in town for a couple hours to exchange language lessons. During these meetings, we cracked jokes and laughed a lot, but it was harmless flirting rather than anything romantic. For me, it was simply a pleasant way to pass the time, as well as to improve my French. Sometimes it was easy to forget the recent fighting, but I never forgot that I was an enemy soldier in an occupying army. Upon completing her 3-year florist apprenticeship with honours at the end of September, Anneliese, meanwhile, had left Lüneburg and returned to Hamburg, where she had found work at a flower shop in the main station. We agreed to see each other there on my way back to Verviers from Puggen at the end of my second furlough, which lasted from November 17th to December 12th. When the train reached the Hamburg station about noon that day, I headed over to the shop where Anneliese was working. Taking off her apron, she joined me for a stroll through the station and into the adjoining neighbourhood. Reaching a quiet spot at the north side of the station, I presented her with an expensive bottle of perfume that I had purchased in Verviers. As she embraced me in thanks, the bottle slipped from her hand and shattered, filling the whole area with a powerful aroma. It did not seem like a promising omen. Anneliese and I were still involved, but had never agreed to pursue an exclusive relationship. In fact, there was a very pretty girl from the Ruhr city of Duisburg who I had encountered fleetingly back in 1937 when she had been visiting her relatives in Puggen. 3 years after this initial meeting, I decided to renew our acquaintance and somehow obtained her address. After we had exchanged a couple of letters, the girl agreed to allow me to come visit her in the Ruhr on my way back to Belgium, unaware that I would be coming from my brief visit with Anneliese in Hamburg. Our subsequent evening together in Duisburg inclined the girl to favour a more serious relationship, though it made me realise that my attraction was only to her looks. Less than a month later, I joined in a drinking session with Schutter, my comrade from boot camp, and a few other enlisted men in our quarters in Verviers. Growing increasingly inebriated, we began to complain about our difficulties with our girlfriends back home. When the suggestion was made that we should write letters dumping them, we all swore to one another we would do just that. This drunken promise gave me the final push to break off my close relationship with Anneliese, something that I had already been considering. Composing my thoughts in a letter on January 10th, I told her that I was not ready for the serious commitment that she sought. We were too young to get married, especially when it was uncertain whether I would even survive the war. While there had been no further correspondence with the girl in Duisburg in the weeks since my visit, I still felt compelled to inform Anneliese that I had met someone else. Without going into detail, I said that the relationship was not serious, but that I did not wish to go behind her back and cheat on her. Even if I had no intention of seeing the girl in Duisburg again, it just seemed to me that Anneliese and I should both feel free to see whom we desired. Concluding my thoughts, I conveyed my sincere wish for us to remain friends and keep in touch. Much later, I learned that she cried for days when she received the letter. Late in 1940, meanwhile, each regiment of our division had been ordered to surrender one of its 3 battalions to serve as an experienced nucleus for new divisions. Similar to the earlier pattern, the loss of these battalions was made up by freshly trained recruits. Clearly, the army was still undergoing an expansion in size, though none of us were aware of the ultimate purpose. That spring, our division travelled 25 miles to the east for a week or two of intensive training at a sprawling facility beside the Belgian town of Elsenborn, just across the border from Germany. In bone-chilling rain, we carried out battalion-sized military manoeuvres in close coordination with panzers and the Luftwaffe, while we in the communications platoon repeatedly practiced stringing telephone and telegraph lines from the front to the rear. Our company's gun crews drilled on the howitzers with live ammunition. By the end of the exercises, our skills were honed to a fine edge. On April 21, 1941, our Vorkommando advance team left for the east. 2 days later, our division was issued 24 hours' notice to prepare to leave Belgium. Even if some of the staff had been involved in advanced planning for our transfer, organising a move was a time-consuming task due to the number of horses and volume of equipment. The lack of more advance notice was inconvenient to planners, but was intended to keep our relocation as secret as possible. Late in the afternoon of April 24th, most of our division's troops were ready to leave, though some elements would join us later. Boarding our trains in Verviers, we still lacked any information about our destination. Not even our company commander knew where we were headed. During our journey across Germany, everyone around me was wondering out loud, "Where the heck are we going? What will happen next?" A funny thing about military life is the prevalence and power of rumours. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and anticipation as various theories raced around the train about our mission. Conjecture focused on a destination somewhere up north. Some predicted, "We are headed to Finland." With equal confidence, other troops maintained, "We are going to Sweden." Both rumours proved wrong.